Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. We're going to be pausing soon our series on revolutionary ideas to do something else, which I'll tell you about at the end of this episode. But before that, we're talking about, for many people, the two great revolutionaries of the 20th century, for better or for worse, love them or hate them, Lenin and Trotsky. This is a conversation with the historian of modern Russia, Edward Acton, about the two men, about their backgrounds, about what made them revolutionaries, about the differences between them, and about how they created the Russian Revolution. We're going to talk about these two lives really as parallel lives, I think, but we should probably start with their upbringings and background, because there's not a parallel story there. And there's a lot of mythologizing. Just looking online, young Lenin, young Trotsky, still, I imagine it was worse a while back, but there's a lot of myth-making, a lot of trying to find iconic incidents and images. Should we start with Lenin? Tell us a bit about his childhood, his youth. It did eventually become very traumatic, but what were the circumstances in which he grew up?
Well, the setting was relatively comfortable for late 19th century Tsarist Russia. His father was an education inspector and reasonable income. And it seems to have been a very stable, happy family, 5 children. Like most educated people, his parents critical of the regime, but not involved in seditious activity. And Lenin, it seems to have been from very early on a very determined little boy and highly intelligent, a real starter-finisher and jolly well prepared for his exams and starred in all his exams. And then when he was a relatively late teenager, his elder brother, of whom he was very fond, was arrested for trying to assassinate Alexander III. Alexander II had been successfully assassinated 6 years earlier and was executed. And that was a huge trauma for the whole family and is rightly thought to have played a big part in radicalizing Lenin. The obvious thing was to sort of avenge his brother.
The movement his brother belonged to, the Narodniks, I believe they were called. So that was a very distinctly 19th century form of revolutionary activity. It was terrorism, really. But it was, as I understand it, it was the kind of thing that Lenin, on the one hand, wanted to avenge, on the other hand, very much also move beyond, because the Narodniks, it was that idea of somehow connecting with Russia, the peasantry, the people. It was not a proletarian revolutionary movement.
No, absolutely. For the Narodniks, the people really were primarily the peasantry, who were well over 80% of the population. Amongst themselves, they debated a lot how to mobilize the peasantry, and there was a wing that thought the thing to do is to demonstrate Tsarism is very fragile, assassinate the Tsar, and there'll be a moment of panic, and then the peasants will realize, well, now we can take the land that we're longing for. Many Narodniks didn't approve of that, but there were some who did, including Lenin's older brother.
So it was sort of, I think it's sometimes called the terrorism of the deed, the idea that the dramatic event is enough to galvanize the people. And it was, among other things, proof that that concept didn't work.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lenin then, rather like a whole, by then almost a tradition, went to university, took part in a pretty innocuous student assembly and promptly got expelled. And it's been demonstrated that actually ever since the 1860s, really heavy-handed treatment of what could be fairly ephemeral student protest radicalised students. University students were an extraordinarily special minority. There were now about 130 million people in the country, about 10,000 undergraduates. So in this country, doubled, one rather small university, the equivalent of, and they had an enormous sense of being the intelligence of the country. That played a very big part in radicalizing a minority of students, cohort after cohort after cohort. And if they were heavy-handedly treated while students, it seems to have exacerbated that. Lenin, a case in point.
And the radicalization of Lenin early on included exposing him or him being exposed to Marxist ideas. So his brother was not a Marxist. His brother was a Narodnik, and the death of his brother was something to be avenged. But it was Marxism that marked Lenin out as different from his brother.
Well, absolutely. And if one was to sort of ask the longer term question, yes, but many young people got involved in radicalism and then moved off. And Lenin did become a lawyer for a bit, but never standing back from revolution. It was Marxism that really thrilled him. He was one of those Marxists in the late 19th century who, as Engels said, really did think Marx has done for history, social change, political order, what Darwin did for nature. He's understood how human society works. The way we make things shapes the way we relate to each other, shapes property relations, divides us into classes. And because, as we develop better ways of making things, the social order has to change. There are successive revolutions. And eventually we'll be so good at producing things, there will be such potential abundance that we will realize our common interest lies in collective ownership and the end of what until then drives history, class struggle. He was convinced that this is how history works, that you could look at the past and it explained everything. And in Russia, it fitted beautifully. And unlike the Narodniks, the Marxists found that their prime constituency, workers, were highly responsive, were fascinated by this vision. And so it sort of underlined their conviction. This was truth.
Before we get on to Trotsky, I want to ask two more things about Lenin. So as you said there, Lenin was convinced that it fitted the case of Russia, this doctrine. But many people weren't, including, I think, Marx. But Engels is a crucial link here. Marx died before Engels, and Engels and Lenin did have some contact, and the Marxists in Russia did communicate with Engels. And Engels was, I think, encouraging of the idea that revolution can happen anywhere, but Russia might actually be pretty fertile ground for this kind of thing, not least because Russia had a sense of communal ownership. And though the Russian proletariat was pretty underdeveloped, nonetheless, the coming together of proletarian revolutionary consciousness and some of the Russian traditions of common ownership might make Russia maybe not at the vanguard of European revolution, but certainly not the laggard that many people in Germany, particularly in Germany, thought that it was.
Yes, but in a way, the approaches to Marx, and then you were quite right, at greater length to Engels, tended to be by Narodnik, saying, don't you think we could go faster because we've got the peasants and they have a commune that is redistributable, and so the collectivist roots are much stronger. And both Marx and later Engels sort of said, well, that could help. But the working class, the industrial working class, is critical, and it is tiny. And on their own, they're not going to succeed. There would have to be revolution elsewhere. So the initial sort of nods were made more to Russian populists, Narodniks, than to Russian Marxists.
The other question is about a book that Lenin said was incredibly important for him when he was young. And he borrowed the title for the best known of his early works, What is to be Done. So that's Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, which tends to be classified as a work of nihilism. And Lenin was not a nihilist. So what did he take from that, apart from the fact that when you're a teenager, those kinds of books can be very inspiring? I think he said he read it 5 times in a single summer, as young men do. But what, because he was to take the title of it for a very different kind of book to be called What is to be Done. But where was the inspiration in 1860s nihilism for Lenin?
Chernyshevsky's was a novel, unlike Lenin's more famous work. I think above all, the sort of steely dedication of revolutionary intelligentsia who hardened themselves into figures who could provide vital leadership and resilience against repeated police attacks. I think that was the theme that translated from, Chernyshevsky was a Narodnik, but more interested in workers than the older generation. But peasants were still the main point. But the leadership and the sort of extremely strong man picture he drew of a really dedicated revolutionary, that excited Lenin.
Trotsky did not have an equivalent trauma in his childhood to Lenin's, the death of his older brother. And Lenin, the story of Lenin is completely different, but it did remind me a little bit of another person whose brother, I believe Lenin's brother was the family understood his older brother as the one on whom the hopes were placed. The Kennedy clan, John F. Kennedy, the death of his older brother, in his case, not because he was executed, but in wartime, and suddenly the transference of the leadership of that generation of the family from one boy to another, and the sort of creation of a person's sense of destiny that can come out of that. Trotsky, there's nothing like that, I think. There's no equivalent trauma. There's no moment that you can say in Trotsky's youth, childhood, adolescence when something happened to him. Is that fair to say? He was radicalised simply by life, books.
That is fair to say. I think by books, by the sort of atmosphere around his family. I think one would emphasize his family were Jewish, and the restrictions and the obstacles to really very bright young Jewish children and boys and girls getting anywhere were very frustrating. He didn't major on that, but the evidence is that, like many Jewish people, he was very conscious that the state was deliberately trying to restrict the number who could go to university, try and contain the Jews and limit the number of professions they could enter. His sister became a revolutionary. All Lenin's siblings became revolutionaries. One's got to stress they're not sort of quirky characters driven offline. Their milieu is making it one of the options open to you. And I think in both cases, and very much in Trotsky's, he became extremely excited by ideas. He began as a Narodnik as well. He dropped out of university without even needing to be expelled. He dropped out quite soon, getting bored by engineering and excited by getting involved in a very small agitational group. But the excitement of being able to really master and grasp the complexity of what Marx was proclaiming, what Marx had analysed. And I think for both those intellectuals, that really was critical in their radicalisation. Had Marx not been there, it's harder to see that they would have had enough food for their intellect in the revolutionary movement.
I have no idea if this is true or not, whether it's a cliche, whether it's one of the ways in which people try and distinguish between Lenin and Trotsky that isn't borne out by the historical evidence. But there are some versions of the story of their early life that implies that Trotsky had more direct interaction with actual workers. So as a young man, part of his agitation was among the workers themselves. And in Lenin's case, it was a little bit more at one remove, a little bit more book learnt than learnt in action. And that on some accounts of these two men, that follows through. There's often a sense, I think, that Trotsky is more comfortable among the people on whose behalf this revolution is being fought. And though Lenin is their champion and is at the vanguard of them, Lenin is a little bit more of a book-learnt revolutionary than Trotsky was. So I have no idea if that's true. Is it true?
I think the distinction you draw, I think it is true. I think it is true. And I suppose Trotsky, at an even younger age, had real involvement in a little agitational group before being arrested and then spending a great deal of time with his books in prison and then in exile. So one can sort of see hints of it from very, very early on, that distinction. I think their involvement in 1905 is very markedly different in that respect and gives a huge boost to Trotsky's real interaction with workers. But yes, I think that starting point is valid.
One shared experience that they had, as you said, exile. Exile meant Siberia. And I, like a lot of people, being exiled to Siberia, in my mind, it raises various images, some of which are clearly later in the sense that the 20th century versions of it under the Leninist and then Stalinist regimes are horrific beyond words. In their case, it's not that. It's not the Gulag. Actually, it seems like it was an opportunity for both of them to do a lot of reading, in the counterproductive way that if you stamp out the first hint of student rebellion, you might end up turning the rebels into revolutionaries. If you send them to Siberia with their books, they're going to come back probably better informed rather than reformed characters. And it seems to have happened in both cases.
Absolutely. Sometimes it has been described as the finishing school for a revolutionary because there is so much time. They're not put to hard labor. That is a threat if you commit certain offenses once you're in Siberia. And in both cases, there's a period in prison and then in Siberia, they read an enormous amount. In Lenin's case, this is when he does his one great work of research. And his theme is how far has capitalism developed in rural Russia? Critical to sort of understand, and he's persuaded that it's developed very fast, and the peasants are differentiating between richer peasants and poorer or landless peasants. And the latter are, of course, a huge reservoir of potential support for the rather tiny working class. So he's absolutely determined on this. It turns out to be something, as we'll come back to this, of an optical illusion. But he completed that book while in exile. And I suppose the other revolutionaries they met a great deal of time talking about Marx while you're in Siberia with tiny numbers of people to interact with, but mostly other political exiles. And in Lenin's case, he met and fell in love with one of them and married them, and for the rest of his life, a stable marriage, no children. Trotsky, much younger when he was sent to prison in Siberia. While in prison, he managed to have delivered to him a huge number of books. And when in Siberia, his reading was enormous and much wider than Lenin's. He read the classics. Partly why his later writing and rhetoric are so colourful is because he had time at this point. I suppose a little bit in the same kind of mood as you were distinguishing, Lenin finishes his period in exile and then is released and allowed to come back and become a practicing lawyer and revolutionary. Trotsky doesn't put up with it, escapes with a false passport and has to go underground. But the sort of daring do of his escape, leaving a very young wife and 2 children in Siberia and fleeing, I think both sort of reflected his very can-do attitude and his much less caution than Lenin, whose arrangements are tidy.
And in the escape, choosing the name Trotsky, which is not the name he was born with.
Absolutely, absolutely. He tried out various pen names, but he settled with Trotsky.
It's hard to know with hindsight whether it seems like genius because it's Trotsky or just, it's like, is the Beatles a great name for a band or is it just because they were the Beatles? Is Trotsky the great name for a revolutionary or it just happens it was Trotsky? Part of the story, so there's exile to Siberia, there's exile east, but also part of this story has to move west as well. Marx, Engels in Britain, in Marx's case in London, a lot of exiles through the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th on the revolutionary side of Russian politics wind up in London. And so some of the action also moves there. And in 1901, I believe it's 1901, when Lenin published What Is to Be Done, which in some ways is what made his name. As the 20th century began, where would you say the two men are relative to the wider movement of Russian revolutionary politics? Is it just with hindsight that What Is to Be Done looks like a very important publication?
Well, within their tiny little Marxist party, and it very quickly felt very important. Sort of world historic importance, yes, that's very much hindsight. They were in some ways extremely close in that, like many very radical Marxists, they thought, yes, the thing is to create a party to lead the revolutionaries and to maximize the use of their very limited numbers. Like others, they held as their great sort of icon Plekhanov, who had been the figure who translated Marx and first began saying the Narodniks have got it all wrong. Russia has to follow the path of capitalism laid out by Marx and Engels. And they were in support of a newspaper created to sign the nucleus of a party. Lenin and Trotsky were both all for that. But when it came to the first effective, the second formal conference of the new Social Democratic Party, Lenin came out with What Is to Be Done with a very distinctive attitude to membership of the party, and behind that a sort of nuance about the leadership role of the party that Trotsky wouldn't go all the way with. So you do see at that point them beginning to follow different paths.
Is that Leninist version considerably more exclusive than what Trotsky had come to understand the revolution would involve, in the sense that What Is to Be Done does argue for a party which will be the driving force of the revolution? The revolution will have to be led by a very small group of people who are ruthless and trained and all the rest of it. I think one can exaggerate the extent to which it's this kind of absolutely ruthless vanguard movement. But nonetheless, was Trotsky someone who had a vision of a more open revolution, a more participatory revolution, something more like an authentic workers' revolution? Or is that exaggerating the difference between them? It's not Lenin, the party man, Trotsky, no, this has to be the workers who do it for themselves. It's not as stark as that, is it?
It's not as stark as that. Lenin's argument was that there is terrible danger of a party that is at all woolly about membership, partly because, of course, the party is illegal. All parties are illegal in Russia at the time, so infiltration by the police is a doddle if you let in anybody. But much more because he was observing that in the West, in his view, what was happening was that parties and would-be revolutionaries who were Marxist were actually following a more moderate line than he found acceptable. They were beginning to sort of accept piecemeal gains, trade unions and stronger negotiations with employers. And in Germany, of course, a social democratic party that was beginning to look so plausible that maybe you're not going to need a revolution. You might actually win a majority in parliament. And he was horrified by the thought that that can so easily happen. The bourgeoisie are so powerful, not just behind them stands the state, but they control the press, they control education, they use the church, they infiltrate through ideas and try and mislead the sort of natural development of working class understanding of their predicament. And against that, you've got to have something very, very vigorous and rigorous. So don't let in any old reformist into the party, or no time you'll find they too are becoming mere trade unionists, only interested in economics, infinitely patient about revolution. Trotsky would not have said, oh, you don't need a party. He said, of course you need a party, but don't be so neurotic and don't plan for a party that has the potential. And he did make this brilliant criticism in 1904 that under Lenin's prescription, the organization, the party, will replace the class, the central committee will replace the organization, and one fine day, a dictator will replace the central committee. Typical, devastating polemic, and in retrospect, alarmingly prescient. But it would be a mistake to sort of imagine that Trotsky didn't want a party. He absolutely wanted a party, didn't think that there needs to be a vanguard. Yes, there needs to be a vanguard. But he regarded Lenin as unnecessarily purist, and he wanted unity. He wanted the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks to stay together. So he wasn't a sort of average Menshevik. He was a jolly radical Menshevik, but he wasn't going to kowtow to Lenin.
They were both critics of what came to be known as economism, the idea that this could morph into, as you said, more like radical trade unionism looking for economic gains rather than the crucial thing for both of them, which is political transformation. The Leninist version got the name for relatively obscure reasons, Bolshevism. And also, as you say, it's not as though Trotsky was a Menshevik, Lenin was a Bolshevik. Here's the division that's going to sort of characterize them through. As I understand it, Trotsky was a kind of, let's just calm down a bit and see if we can't all rub along a bit more. And Lenin was always keen on establishing the dividing line and putting his opponents on the other side of it. So Trotsky was more, though as radical as Lenin, more conciliatory in some ways than Lenin was. It's not a huge difference. It's not ideology, but it's partly temperament, I think.
It is partly temperament. I think Trotsky had a little more respect for the older generation. There was a character alongside Plekhanov called Axelrod, who he was very sympathetic to, and they were not up for Lenin's ideas. They were going to be, this older generation, find themselves on the Menshevik side. So it's useful to hold on to that element of Trotsky that doesn't want to go the whole way to division. There's something that is rather more conciliatory within his milieu.
The key year for both of them before 1917 and perhaps before 1914 was 1905. And their experiences are very different, I think it's fair to say. They have a very different experience of that Russian revolution. In Lenin's case, it seems to me he spent the whole year just furious, just sort of in an absolute rage of frustration at what he saw was the failure of his fellow revolutionaries to grasp the moment and also to understand sufficiently theoretically with sufficient conceptual sophistication what they were dealing with. Too many of them were either stuck with this economic view of a revolution or stuck with a far too crude version of Marxism where they said this is the wrong revolution, maybe this is the bourgeois revolution, we'll sit this one out. And Lenin, being a true revolutionary, was just, it's a revolution and we're revolutionaries and we're the only people who understand what a revolution truly is, so we should just make it our revolution. But it was the rage of someone who felt that he was perhaps losing that fight. Would that be fair to say, within the movement?
Yes, I think you're right. I think he was intensely frustrated. He's abroad until December, until almost the end of the year. And his own party committee men in Russia were not kowtowing to what he said and were in some ways sort of more doctrinaire than he was, rather reluctant about getting involved in working class organizations that began to spring up as the Tsar's control loosened. And he was much keener that they get involved. Now that there's some real liberty, you can begin to recruit workers much more actively than ever you could before. So in some ways you can see him not as the most extreme of the Bolsheviks, whereas he was the original Bolshevik. But at this point, he's rather more mobile in his thinking. Trotsky was there from very early in the year, and his experience really was very formative for him. He quickly got involved in the emerging working class organizations, committees, and unions that were beginning to have some possibility of acting. And he was so effective, incredibly young. He's only in his mid-20s, but he was such an effective orator, journalist, agitator, writer of pamphlets, drafter of motions and manifestos, that when in St. Petersburg the first of these remarkable workers' councils emerged, the Soviet, it was actually the second, but much the most important one, emerged, immediately he was made vice chair and eventually became chair. And even while he was vice chair, he was in some ways the most dynamic, moving figure. Well, he found real workers were incredibly radical. He became very confident that the educated workers, the skilled workers, are as radical as you could hope. So it sort of relaxed him that, yes, they are the vanguard. Yes, we need a party, but they really very quickly grasped the point is to overthrow the Tsar and to do more than that, to push the employers to get the 8-hour day now and to transform the way in which workers are treated, which in Tsarist Russia is horrendous. And there are moments when, yes, the working class is almost too radical and he can see they're going to be knocked back, at which point you would think the need for a party that is taking a strategic view is reinforced. You can't do without the party. But don't think there's that much danger in Russia of it being infiltrated by the kind of workers who will not go beyond trade unionism.
So he didn't think that these radical demands for an 8-hour day, for transformed working conditions, risked lapsing into economism and being satisfied with material change. He thought that it's a revolution, and in a revolution, radical workers' demands, when they're met, will produce demands for more change. He wasn't worried in the way I think Lenin maybe was, although, as you say, Lenin was compromising on some of the more doctrinaire positions. But that fear that if the party isn't at the head of this, at a certain point, the workers, because they don't truly understand what it is they're doing, will take a wrong turn. Whereas for Trotsky, it's as though the workers they're on the march. It's on the move. And the two phrases, when people want to really separate these two men out, the two catchphrases that are associated with them that distinguish them is, on the one hand, for Lenin, the party is the vanguard of the proletariat. The phrase that's associated with Trotsky is the idea of the permanent revolution. Was that his experience of 1905? Is that a really significant difference between them, that Trotsky comes to have confidence that once the revolution is on the move, it has a life of its own and it doesn't require exactly what Lenin thought it needed, which is a party to keep pulling it along?
Yes, it is an absolutely key moment, and it is a conclusion that Trotsky, who's naturally by the end of the year back in prison, draws, and he has time then to set it out at some length. He has very little fear that the workers will be bought off, because the workers in Russia's experience is that the moment the Tsar sees he's in real danger in October, he issues a manifesto saying, all right, there'll be a parliament and there'll be some civil rights and everybody calm down. The moment that happens, in Trotsky's eyes and Lenin's, the bourgeoisie swing to the right, and the workers find the employers absolutely defy them, lock out, not a chance of an 8-hour day. And behind the employers stands the regime. So the conclusion he draws is the bourgeoisie in Russia is never going to push through what we might call the democratic revolution. It's not going to get rid of the Tsar. It's not going to institute the 8-hour day. It's not going to solve the land question. The workers will have to lead a government that delivers what Marx might have suggested the bourgeoisie must deliver. And if they do that, they will actually want to go very quickly beyond merely the 8-hour day. They will begin to want to really guide the direction in which industry is run. They will find themselves stepping on the toes of employers and going in the first steps towards socialism. And should revolution in Russia trigger revolution in the vastly more developed industrial West, and socialism begin there, it will help them, and you'll have a permanent interplay and an extraordinarily rapid move towards building socialism. Not communism, which is abundance. That's going to take a long time because Russia's so backward. So permanent revolution, the notion that the workers themselves must deliver the democratic revolution, the bourgeoisie are useless. On no account form an alliance with the bourgeoisie against the Tsar. The bourgeoisie are a write-off. Get the peasants to support you, but the workers are critical, and he's delighted that he finds during the great 50 days of the St. Petersburg Soviet, the Mensheviks in St. Petersburg moved to the left very sharply. So that too calms him about the party. He still thinks a party is going to be needed, a vanguard's going to be needed. Some workers are much more conscious than others. But he's got very direct experience of really radical, educated, conscious workers, and that really inspires him through to 17.
At this point, are he and Lenin on the same page on that question of the internationalization of the revolution, and that Trotsky came to be, still is in many ways associated with the idea that the true revolution is going to have an international dimension? And later on, and we'll come on to it much later on, it's possible to argue that Lenin took a different view once the revolution in Russia had to be defended. But in 1905 and in the period after that, is it fair to say they both understood that for a Russian revolution of the kind they wanted ultimately to succeed, it couldn't just be a revolution in Russia? Or were there differences between them even then?
Well, I think the real commonalities, I think if asked that question, Lenin would have said, yes, of course.
Because Marx says it. Marx is the great internationalist, so of course.
Yes, and Russia's just too poor and too backward on its own. There are not the social conditions or the economic conditions for socialism. Social conditions, there aren't enough proletarians. Economic conditions, there isn't enough wealth. And they were on the same page that Lenin too thought bourgeoisie hopeless, useless. He was much more sort of explicit about there must be an alliance of workers and peasants. Trotsky was, but he put the emphasis on the workers must lead, leaning on the peasants. And Lenin put more emphasis on, as it were, joint, but of course led by workers, not peasants. But he thought that the agenda for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants would essentially be democratic. It would be get rid of the Tsar. It would be a constituent assembly. It would be the 8-hour day. He did not think we can start talking at this point of going further than that towards socialism. He thought that's premature. So on key things, they are on the same page. No alliance with the bourgeoisie, whereas many Russian Marxists will quite quickly think, look, we have to. We're too weak on our own. The Tsar so easily crushed the Soviet at the end of 1905. We have to have the bourgeoisie on side. And Lenin and Trotsky are both saying absolutely not.
Let's fast forward to 1914. Lots of things happened between 1905 and 1914, but we're just going to have to bracket that. Before 1917, 1914 is the absolutely crucial year. Among other things, I think for both Lenin and Trotsky, it confirmed many of their fears about what might happen if the Party of the Workers, the Socialist Party, pursued a parliamentary route, because Germany in particular becomes the exemplar of how it can go wrong, because in 1914, the representatives of the workers in the German parliament support the war. On a celebrated day with Rosa Luxemburg in the balcony in utter despair. How can these people who were they were meant to be the vanguard of the proletariat? And here comes the real choice, which is, do you reject a war which is clearly a war of imperialism and capitalism and so on, and the established regimes, or do you back it? And one thing that I don't think Lenin and Trotsky, either of them, ever waver on, and it's the thing that binds them at the hip, is the idea that this war is so obviously a calamity, but also something that simply has to be stopped at all costs. To be a revolutionary is completely inconsistent with any form of political activity which could be seen as prolonging, enabling, allowing for this kind of conflict. And that did put them at odds with many, many people who had until this point called themselves socialists.
Absolutely, absolutely. And put them amongst that stream of radical socialists who said the Second International, formed in 1889, centenary of the French Revolution, bringing together workers' movements across Europe, had failed. It had demonstrably betrayed the working class. It had allowed the French workers to be forced into the war, and the German workers, and, as you say, supported their own governments. So on that, they were as one, and they both began to talk about the need for a third international. But they went in exactly the same place, because Lenin went all the way and said, the least bad thing is the defeat of your own government. And for we Russians, all things are awful. The war is pure destruction. It is the product of capitalism at its highest stage. Finance capitalism looking for markets and leading to clashes between the great states. But in that situation, what authentic revolutionary Marxists must do is yearn to turn that into essentially a civil war, all workers across the continent united against employers across the continent. And what you can do in your own country is work to undermine your own government, to try and bring your own government down, and that will lead to defeat. And Trotsky couldn't go that far. As you said, he could never support, wouldn't dream of lending the slightest hint of support to his own government. But the notion of sort of preferring the defeat of your own, he, like most of those who met in 1915 to explore what might follow the Second International, he thought that would in a way be a terrible betrayal of the enemy. If Russia did collapse and drop out of the war, the Social Democrats in Germany would be gravely weakened. Their regime would be so much more powerful. So he looked for a compromise, and at the gathering in Switzerland of very radical socialists, he drafted the conclusion and he voted with the majority against Lenin's defeatism, it was called, actually working for your own country to be defeated. But in other respects, he and Lenin are getting closer together. Lenin, reading the international roots of the war, gets much closer to thinking the way Trotsky had been thinking since 1905, that the interaction between what happens in Russia and the West, they are so interdependent, and a revolution might indeed start in Russia and might trigger revolution in the West.
And I think they both believed, and this does matter for what happened after 1917, that the war was a great opportunity, not least because at some point it would be revealed just how the great powers had stumbled into this war. The corruption, the deals, all of the backstage stuff would come out into the open, and the workers would see the ways in which this war that was presented to them as a sort of patriotic, noble struggle was actually the most squalid series of broken promises and compromises and deal-making, and that for both of them, the war was the great opportunity to let the workers know, the workers who were being sent to their deaths in the name of these squalid arrangements, just how they had been betrayed by the ruling classes. That was the great hope from 1914 onwards, that no one could be in any doubt after that the workers are just cannon fodder for the squalid deals of their masters.
They thought just the publication of all the secret treaties and the deals about the transfer of territories over the heads of workers and everybody else would have such an impact as to enormously enhance working class consciousness and demand for political change.
As you say, in 1915, Trotsky where there is a difference between them, comes out on top. Lenin's radical defeatism is somewhat marginalized. These are two very important figures in this swirling movement and in this extremely uncertain time. In 1917, in that year, from the beginning of that year to the end of that year, Lenin emerges as the leader. Not unequivocally the leader, not the leader that in hindsight he becomes, the man who made the Russian Revolution happen, but nonetheless, by the end of 1917, Lenin is at the head of the Bolshevik Revolution, with Trotsky very close behind him, but still I think it's fair to say behind him. What had to happen in 1917 for that to be possible? Lenin produced a series of documents, the April Theses, which are statements of intent, the text State and Revolution, which is a remarkably high concept, high theory thing to write in the middle of not quite in the middle of a revolution, because the Bolshevik Revolution hasn't happened, but in the period between the February Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin produced this extraordinary text, which is, among other things, a kind of echo of some of the arguments around the Paris Commune. Did he sort of write himself into the leadership of the movement? How did he do it?
I think he did it by, when he got back to Russia in April, the Tsar had been overthrown in February. The socialists at the center and Mensheviks were more prominent than Bolsheviks, and SRs extremely prominent, decided they had to find some modus vivendi with the bourgeoisie. So the liberals formed a provisional government, and the question for socialists was, what attitude do we take to this liberal government? And the dominant view of Mensheviks and Bolsheviks was, well, no way do we form an actual coalition, but we have to give them conditional support because we're at war. If you overthrow them, what do you do about the war? And if you overthrow them and try and knock them out of office, you're very likely to alienate the officers and the bourgeoisie, not just big property owners, but sort of settled citizens. And at the moment, the risk of a counter-revolution is so great. Don't do that. Lenin gets back at the beginning of April and is far more radical. He says there must be no sort of talk about this provisional government pursuing peace. It can't. It's capitalist. It's imperialist. It won't. That is just misleading workers. The opposite. Absolutely no truck with this provisional government. And he lays out 10 remarkable theses. He's been abroad. He's been much frustrated by many of his things not being accepted by Bolshevik press in Russia. He's not the all-dominant figure who just has to lift a finger and the party obeys. But what happens is that the radical stance he takes matches extremely impatient, militant demands of Bolsheviks slightly lower down, many of them genuine workers, who are delighted to hear Lenin take a far more radical view than the Bolsheviks who were already there, who were much closer to reuniting with the Mensheviks and finding a way of conditional support for the provisional government. And here's Lenin saying, to hell with that, to hell with any kind of support for the war, fraternization, encourage soldiers to make friends with the Germans in the trenches opposite, to end the war that way. And he makes a series of demands that we must move not to a parliamentary republic. That would be a backward step, but to a government based on the Soviets. The Soviets have re-emerged with tremendous energy across the country as the Tsar collapses. And Lenin regards them as the potential base for a socialist-based government.
I sort of think of one of Lenin's rhetorical devices, much more blunt than Trotsky's rhetoric, as being, when confronted with something like the question of what to do in April 1917 and people saying, but we can't bring this government down because if we bring this government down, the war effort will collapse. We'll sort of end up surrendering. And Lenin just says, good. There is a sort of bluntness to it, which is Lenin thinks the war is a very bad thing. If we do this thing, the thing that Lenin thinks is a bad thing will come to an end. People are saying, but the way it comes to an end will be worse. And Lenin just says, I don't care. The thing that you are saying is the reason not to do it. I am simply telling you is the reason to do it. He was a bit like that in 1905 when people said, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do that. And he would say, we're Marxists. We're the only people who can do whatever we want because we're the people who have the secret sauce. And there's a bit of that in 1917 as well. I don't know if it's revolutionary genius, but it's absolutely brutal, among other things.
Brutal. extraordinarily self-confident because nobody, initially it felt like nobody agreed with him. There was sort of shock horror when he began with these ideas. He said he read out the April theses twice to two meetings very slowly because he knew that this would be explosive. Why it's so important, I think, in understanding, but how could Lenin, marginalized, bit of a has-been he could look during the war and before the war, how could he by October head the government of the largest country in the world? He placed his party at exactly the political point that the development in Russia during the war were driving soldiers who wanted to end the war. They'd had enough of fighting. When the provisional government launched an offensive, mass mutiny. Workers who were absolutely fed up of horrendous inflation, not nearly enough food, and growing threats to their jobs. And peasants who were determined, now the Tsar's gone, we will take noble land. That's Lenin's program, and that's what, without Lenin having to say anything, that's what the Russian people wanted. Some party was going to benefit from this torrent pushing in a radical direction. Lenin's genius was to ensure that it was a Marxist party, his party, that did. Otherwise, it might well have been the heirs of the Narodniks, the socialist revolutionaries, who had the ears of much the largest part of the population, the peasantry.
So we're going to pick this story up, but just to end not with Lenin, but with Trotsky. At this point, Lenin is very slowly reading out the April theses. He is, in some ways, adopting a fringe position that comes to be the dominant position. Is Trotsky swept along by it? Does he enable it in some way? Or is he made uncomfortable by it? Or maybe all three?
Well, Trotsky is spending an awful lot of his trying to get back to Russia. And he only arrives in May, by when an awful lot's happened in 6 weeks between April and late May. And his attitude is immediately very close to Lenin's. Absolutely no support for the provisional government. No way will they end the war. And the thing to do is to really ride the tide of popular fury at the mismanagement by the provisional government. When the moderate socialists decide to form a coalition to go into government to prop up the provisional government, he's absolutely horrified. And though he still hasn't yet joined the Bolshevik Party, he's more and more thinking, but my position is so like Lenin's. And Lenin is beginning to talk now about a Soviet state doing things that go beyond the bourgeois stage. In 1905, Lenin was so keen that you can't yet go beyond. In 1917, he is much closer to permanent revolution and saying a Soviet government can institute things that are the harbingers of socialism. So in the summer, Trotsky finally enters the Bolshevik Party, concludes on that Lenin is right. We do need a truly radical vanguard, but he's immensely confident that the party is now being thrown open far more, and the membership swells as this radical tide grows. Even then, Bolshevik membership is a bit more real than other parties. You do have to be nominated and seconded to enter the party by current party members. The SRs, anybody can join at any time. So there is still some notion you only accept people who are pretty well advanced in their class consciousness. And Trotsky is immediately put onto the Central Committee, and for a period they become very, very harmonious, our two gentlemen.
As you say, it's not just that Trotsky has come over to Lenin's side. Lenin does seem to be embracing some ideas, including in the April theses, that look a little like permanent revolution. And as I mentioned, they do have echoes of the Paris Commune. So when you read the April theses, it says things like government officials have to be paid a worker's wage, that this revolution, this way that we are going to make this revolution work, is itself a harbinger of the future structure of a post-revolutionary society, which was thought to be the lesson in some ways of the Paris Commune. That's one of the lessons that Marx took from it, which is it gave a glimpse, not just of how to get rid of the old order, but what the new order might look like. And in April, May, the summer of 1917, Lenin is saying things that have those echoes in them, which are somewhat at odds with how this story is going to play out. So we're going to go on and talk about how the story plays out. Just a question for now, it's maybe an impossible question to answer, but is this Lenin being pragmatic? Or do you think, I can't think of a better word than it's possible to say that this was sincere? It's maybe not the word to ask of Lenin, but...
No, I think it was in April when the 7th or 8th thesis is you abolish the police, you abolish the army, you abolish the bureaucracy. And as you say, in its place, you have administrators elected and immediately recallable and paid no more than an average skilled worker's wage, and footnoted directly to Marx on the Paris Commune.
That was the programme of the Paris Commune, literally.
Absolutely. And of course, he'd begun writing State and Revolution in 1916, finished it in 17, but that is the very heart of it. All that, of course, takes for granted that power has moved. In place of the army, you will have the armed people, and then certain minorities of the people who don't like all this would be disarmed.
That's a euphemism, I think.
Yes. Therefore, you wouldn't need coercion anymore because the state would have taken over the commanding heights of the economy, and the land question, the land would have been turned over to peasant Soviets.
There is a second part to this conversation, which will be out as a bonus episode for subscribers to PPF Plus. That will be available on Saturday. If you would like to subscribe to get part 2 of Lenin and Trotsky and all of our bonus episodes, there's more than a year's worth available for you now. You also get ad-free listening. Just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Part 2 of this conversation takes the story forward from 1917. What happened after the revolution in the Civil War? How did the relationship between Trotsky and Lenin develop? Where does Stalin come into the picture? What might have happened if Trotsky, not Stalin, had succeeded Lenin? And why are people to this day still so attached to the idea of Trotskyism? If you'd like to hear all of that, just sign up to PPF Plus now. There is a new edition of our free fortnightly newsletter out tomorrow to accompany all of our recent episodes, including the ones with Dominic Dromgoole about revolutions in the world of art and theatre. It will have links to some of the things we were talking about, including the paintings that we were talking about. Just click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com, and sign up for the newsletter. It's very easy to do. Our new series, starting on Sunday, is a brief one. It's an interlude in which we're going to be talking about the history of ideas of globalisation to try and make sense of what's going on in the age of Trump, looking at the deep history of the international economic order, the story of protectionism, free trade, tariffs, war, all of it. Starting on Sunday with globalisation in the second half of the 19th century. What was it and how is it like now? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.